September 12, 1942, Guadalcanal. 800 U.S. Marines crouched among the slick jungle brush, staring into the kind of darkness that felt alive. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson had just received intelligence that chilled even the most battle-hardened men under his command. An estimated 2,500 Japanese soldiers were maneuvering unseen through the dense forest, preparing to envelop his position on a narrow coral ridge south of Henderson Field. Any field manual would have called it hopeless. When outnumbered 3-1, doctrine demanded retreat. But Edson's Marines had no such option. Exhausted, short on ammunition, and with the airfield, the lifeline of Guadalcanal, just 800 yards behind them, the colonel made a decision few would dare. "Hold this ridge," he said. "Let them come." The spine of ground they defended rose no more than 60 feet above the surrounding jungle. Hardly a hill, yet it commanded everything that mattered. If Henderson Field fell, the entire American foothold in the Solomon Islands would collapse. To Washington analysts, it was a bump on a map. To the men in the mud, it was the wall between survival and annihilation. Edson's defense stretched along 1,000 yards of rough terrain. His raiders held the north, the parachute battalion the south, each group forming overlapping arcs of fire that would soon become killing zones. But the colonel knew courage and good positioning weren't enough. The Japanese under Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi had built their reputation on ferocity. They advanced through terrain most armies avoided, guided by instinct and fanatic resolve. Around the Marines, the jungle breathed and whispered. Humidity soaked every uniform, fogging rifle sights and corroding metal. Canvas rotted, rations spoiled, and exhaustion carved hollow shadows into young faces. Private Robert Mard, just 3 weeks in country, could feel the tremor of his heartbeat through the worn stock of his Springfield rifle. Beside him, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone adjusted the cooling jacket on his Browning M1917, an aging, water-cooled beast that had already proven it could turn entire hillsides into graveyards. As dusk melted into blackness, the natural symphony of insects faded. That silence was a language every Marine understood. The enemy was near. Edson checked his line one last time. Ammunition distributed. Fields of fire cleared. Artillery coordinates fixed. Then, far below the ridge, came the faint rhythm of boots on soil, thousands of them. Closing in through the trees, the first mortar shells fell just before midnight, hissing through the heavy air like furious wasps before slamming into the ridge with deafening cracks. Dirt and coral rained down on the Marines, followed by the sound every man dreaded. 1,000 voices screaming "Banzai!" from the jungle below. The Japanese were coming. Through the smoke and flashes, Edson moved calmly between his men, his expression as steady as the earth beneath them. "Hold your fire," he warned. "Let them come close." The colonel knew the terrain better than the attackers did. He had mapped every slope, every ravine, every open patch that could channel an assault straight into his guns. When the first wave broke from the treeline, the ridge erupted. Basilone's Browning roared to life, sending heavy rounds tearing through the humid night. The gun's water-cooled barrel glowed faintly, steam mixing with the rising mist as hundreds of tracer rounds carved red arcs across the dark. Rifle fire joined in, a chaotic rhythm of sharp cracks that rolled up and down the defensive line like thunder. The Japanese advanced in tight groups, relying on speed and terror. They had crushed British, Dutch, and Filipino defenses across the Pacific the same way. But this time, their enemy didn't yield. The Marines fought with grim precision, each man firing measured shots, conserving ammunition, refusing panic. Private Mard fired, worked his bolt, and fired again, every movement automatic, every breath steady. Somewhere down the slope, a Japanese officer blew a whistle. Seconds later, another wave emerged, shouting and firing blindly uphill. Mard saw one fall, another stumble, then vanish in the flicker of a mortar blast. Edson's radio crackled with reports from forward posts, multiple attacks converging from south and east. He ordered pre-registered artillery strikes, and a moment later 155mm shells from Henderson Field screamed overhead. Each explosion rolled through the jungle, scattering branches, bodies, and the illusion of Japanese invincibility. But even as the attacks faltered, The Marines understood the cost. Ammunition boxes ran low. Machine gun barrels smoked. The dead and wounded piled up along the ridge's edge, where medics crawled through the mud to drag men back under fire. And still, the Japanese kept coming, filling the gaps left by their fallen comrades, driven by orders to seize the ridge or die on it. Edson looked down from his command post, his face illuminated by muzzle flashes. "They think we'll break," he muttered to a nearby lieutenant. "They still don't understand what Marines do when there's nowhere left to run." The first assault had failed, but the night was far from over. The next wave would test not their courage, but their endurance. The jungle, once deafening, sank into a strange, heavy quiet. Smoke hung low, drifting through the mangled trees as the cries of the wounded echoed from below. For a brief moment, the Marines thought the assault had ended. Then came the metallic clatter of grenades and the rustle of foliage. Another wave was forming in the darkness. Kawaguchi had underestimated them once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The second attack came in greater numbers, spread wider across the ridge, seeking weak spots in Edson's line. But the colonel had anticipated the move. Before sunset, he'd ordered every likely avenue of approach measured, mapped, and marked for artillery fire. Now those coordinates came alive. Mortars from the ridge and guns from Henderson Field joined forces, their fire merging into a symphony of destruction. High explosive rounds shredded through palm trunks and undergrowth, throwing earth, roots, and men skyward. For the attackers, there was no pattern, no safe direction. Every attempt to regroup only exposed them to fresh bursts of Marine gunfire. Gunnery Sergeant Basilon's Browning had become the beating heart of the defense. His team fed the weapon with belt after belt, the cooling water hissing as each burst tore through the advancing ranks. When his assistant gunner was hit, Basilone didn't pause. He shifted position, reloaded, and kept firing, his face lit in the rhythmic glow of muzzle flashes. Farther along the line, Private Mard's hands bled from the rifle's recoil. He had long stopped counting rounds. He fired when he saw movement, when instinct screamed that something was there. Each shot was an act of survival, not heroism. And yet, somehow, the line held. Edson crouched over the field radio, voice steady despite the chaos. "Tell artillery, target 200 yards short. They're massing again." A few seconds later, the ridge trembled under the thunder of friendly fire. Shells detonated so close that fragments whistled through the trees above the Marines' heads. But the timing was perfect. The Japanese formations broke apart, swallowed by their own momentum. Through binoculars, Edson saw the truth. Kawaguchi's men were trapped in their own strategy. They were still fighting by the book, charging, regrouping, charging again against an enemy who refused to play by the rules. When the last echoes faded, the slopes were littered with shattered helmets, torn flags, and motionless bodies. The ridge was still theirs, but at a terrible cost. Dozens of Marines were dead or wounded. Every survivor knew this was only the middle act of the night. Shortly after 2 a.m., the jungle began to whisper again. It wasn't the roar of massed troops this time. It was subtler, more sinister. The Japanese had changed tactics. Instead of bonsai charges, they crept forward in small infiltration groups, slipping through ravines and elephant grass, trying to snake around the Marines' flanks. Edson had seen enough battles to recognize the shift instantly. "They're adapting," he said, scanning the shadows through his field glasses. "They'll try to cut us apart." He ordered his reserve platoons, his most seasoned men, to fan out and intercept. These weren't textbook maneuvers anymore. This was knife-range warfare, fought by feel and instinct. The first infiltrators struck the southern perimeter. Marines fired flares into the sky, painting the ridge in ghostly white light. Figures flickered in and out of the glare. Japanese soldiers darting between trees, tossing grenades, screaming as machine gun fire cut them down mid-stride. A grenade rolled near Basilone's emplacement, exploding just short of his tripod. The concussion blew sand and metal fragments into his face. Half-blind, he kept firing. A few yards away, Private Mard caught movement, two shadows crawling through the grass toward the machine gun crew. He didn't hesitate. One clean shot, then another. When silence returned, he realized he'd fired at barely 20 yards. His hands trembled, but his rifle stayed steady. Fear had no place left to live. All across the ridge, the battle dissolved into dozens of personal wars. Men fought with bayonets, pistols, even entrenching tools when their weapons jammed or ran dry. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt powder. Voices shouted orders that no one could hear over the chaos. Somewhere near the center line, a Japanese soldier burst through the foliage and lunged at a radio operator, only to be tackled and finished off with the butt of a carbine. Edson moved through the melee, rallying men wherever the line buckled. "Keep it tight. They want confusion. Don't give it to them," he shouted, his voice carrying above the gunfire. The colonel's map meant nothing now. The front line had dissolved into fragments, yet somehow his Marines fought like a single organism, each man watching the next, covering, reloading, surviving. As the eastern sky began to pale, the infiltrators finally broke. Without mass, without artillery, their attacks had lost the fury that once terrified Allied forces. By dawn, the ridge still stood, and with it, the balance of Guadalcanal. When the first light crept over the jungle canopy, it revealed a landscape torn apart. The ground steamed where explosions had churned up wet soil, and the slopes below the ridge shimmered with heat and smoke. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, the kind that only comes after something monstrous has spent itself. Edson stepped from his command post, his boots sinking into the damp coral dust. Around him, Marines emerged slowly from their foxholes, blinking against the light like men waking from a nightmare. The ridge was carpeted with empty shell casings, torn equipment, and the still forms of those who hadn't survived the night. Yet, unbelievably, the line held. Reports trickled in. Barcelona's crew had fired nearly 4,000 rounds. 2 of his men were dead, another badly wounded. Private Mard's squad had lost half its strength. Medics moved like ghosts through the aftermath, tagging bodies, treating shrapnel wounds, murmuring prayers. And yet, for all their exhaustion, the Marines felt something else rising inside them, the realization that they had done the impossible. Down below, through the thinning mist, they could see the cost of the Japanese gamble. Hundreds of enemy soldiers lay scattered in clusters that told the story of their failed charges. Entire platoons wiped out in single bursts of artillery or machine gun fire. American scouts counted hundreds of bodies, then stopped counting. Kawaguchi's remaining forces were retreating, not in orderly ranks but in fragments. Officers shouted orders no one obeyed. Mortar fire sputtered aimlessly into the trees, a desperate curtain to hide their withdrawal. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers were breaking off an attack not because they were ordered to, but because they no longer could fight. Edson looked across the ridge at his surviving men. Grime-streaked, hollow-eyed, but still standing. They had proven something vital, something that would echo far beyond Guadalcanal, that the Japanese were not invincible, and that disciplined defenders could turn even hopeless ground into a fortress. At midday, reinforcements arrived from Henderson Field, their boots crunching over the littered ground. The sight of fresh faces almost seemed unreal. One of them stared down the slope and whispered, "How did anyone live through this?" Edson didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the smoke and said, "Because they didn't have a choice." By the afternoon of September 14, 1942, the full scope of what had happened on Edson's Ridge became clear. Patrols sent into the jungle found abandoned mortars, broken rifles, and discarded packs that stretched for miles. The Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade, once 3,000 strong, had been shattered. Fewer than 800 men remained capable of organized combat. The rest were dead, wounded, or lost in the humid wilderness. Captain Suzuki, one of the few surviving Japanese officers, later described what he'd seen from his observation post. Marines firing with mechanical precision, never breaking formation, even when attackers closed within 20 yards. His report reached Tokyo, where disbelief turned to silence. The Imperial Army, built on the myth of spiritual superiority and unyielding courage, had met something it could not outfight: American preparation, discipline, and firepower. Edson's men spent the next hours in grim work, recovering wounded, collecting weapons, and fortifying what was left of their defenses. Private Mard moved among the fallen, unable to reconcile the quiet morning with the nightmare of the night before. He paused beside Bassilone's gun pit, where the gunny was cleaning the Browning as if it were a ritual. The weapon's cooling jacket hissed as fresh water poured in, steam rising like smoke from a dying fire. "Hell of a night," Bassilone muttered. Mard nodded, still staring at the slope below. "Do you think they'll come back?" The sergeant didn't look up. "Not here. Not after this." News of the battle spread quickly across Guadalcanal. Marines called it a miracle. Commanders called it proof. The enemy could bleed. The myth of Japanese invincibility had ended on that ridge, replaced by something far more dangerous for Tokyo: American confidence. Military historians would later call it a turning point. The defense of Edson's Ridge didn't just protect Henderson Field. It preserved the entire Pacific foothold. Air operations from that strip would soon strangle Japanese supply lines, forcing them into retreat after retreat until there was nowhere left to fall back to. For Edson, victory came at a price that words couldn't soften. 43 dead, 97 wounded. Yet those 800 Marines had annihilated over 2,500 enemy soldiers. The numbers spoke of tactics and firepower, but beneath them lay something deeper: endurance, resolve, and leadership forged in chaos. As dusk settled again over Guadalcanal, the colonel stood atop the ridge that now bore his name. The wind carried faint echoes of the night before, the gunfire, the shouts, the roar of mortars. But now only silence remained. He looked out toward Henderson Field, where American planes were taking off one by one, engines growling into the sunset. The ridge had held, the war had turned, and the world had learned what happens when 800